The night had a way of revealing truths that daylight would never dare to touch. Adrian Cole sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the city beyond the wide glass windows, the only soundtrack to his unraveling world. Outside, the skyline shimmered with a deceptive serenity, lights twinkling like 1,000 promises unfulfilled. But inside, the air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves knew the secrets they had been shielding. In that very moment, Adrian realized something he had refused to confront for months. The life he thought was unbreakable was fragile, shattered, and the pieces were falling faster than he could gather them. For years, he had believed in perfection. His career had ascended with a precision that left rivals speechless. He had friends who were loyal, or at least seemed to be, and a family that to the outside world represented the pinnacle of happiness. He looked at his wife, Elena, across the room, reading quietly on the leather couch, her silhouette illuminated by the soft golden glow of the floor lamp. There was a calmness in her posture that unsettled him tonight, something almost too composed, too deliberate. A flicker of unease gnawed at him, a small whisper in the back of his mind he had spent years ignoring, and yet he hadn't wanted to listen. Until tonight, it started with a phone, not an expensive fancy device, but a simple, sleek rectangle that now sat innocuously on the kitchen counter. He had noticed it slip from her grasp more than once, hastily silenced when his eyes fell upon it. But tonight something felt different. He had seen the glimmer of it, the glow of a new message popping up. And in a flash, he had grabbed it, not thinking, not reasoning, only moving on instinct. Kak nadien than takanaka shabanen. The screen was small, but the words on it were large enough to echo in his chest. Can't wait to see you. Alone, tonight it was unsigned, but Adrian knew he didn't need a name. The handwriting of deception, the careful construction of secrecy, was a language he had come to recognize in the subtle shifts of her behavior. Her laughter with a friend that didn't quite reach her eyes. The way she had lingered a moment too long in the bathroom, pretending to make a call. The little lies he had dismissed, thinking he was being paranoid, imagining shadows in sunlight. The truth hit him with the force of a storm. Elena had been seeing someone else, someone close, someone he trusted. Kick. He dropped the phone onto the counter, the clatter sounding impossibly loud in the silence of their apartment. His heart pounded so violently it seemed to shake his entire body, entire bodice. Yet there was an eerie calm beneath the pounding, a quiet, deliberate focus forming in the chaos. Adrian wasn't a man who lost control easily, but he understood in that raw, piercing moment that control had always been an illusion. And yet, the mind, even under shock, is a meticulous machine. The wheels began to turn. He retraced the past few months in rapid succession, each memory like a knife cutting deeper. The dinner invitations Elena had suddenly taken an interest in, claiming she needed to catch up with old friends. The weekends she spent working late at the firm that needed her expertise. The small, imperceptible glances she exchanged with Marcus, his closest friend and business partner, a man Adrian had considered a brother. Adrian's lips pressed into a thin line. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't only the affair, it was the audacity, the systematic way she had embedded herself in this double life, weaving lies so intricate that even he, careful and vigilant, had almost missed it. Almost. And yet, the most devastating blow wasn't the affair itself. It was the feeling of being invisible in his own life, replaced by someone who didn't even need to pretend. The thought of them together, laughing, touching, sharing secrets meant for his absence, made Adrian feel as though he were being erased, dissolved from the world he had fought to build. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, placing his hands against the cold glass. The city outside seemed unbothered by human frailty, each light burning without knowing the pain it overlooked. Adrian's reflection stared back at him, the man he had always believed himself to be, now fractured. The eyes that met his own were sharp and calculating, but underneath, a storm of anguish raged. For hours he watched, silent, unseen, letting the world sleep, while he mapped the contours of betrayal. He didn't scream, he didn't cry. There was a quiet intensity to his observation, a deliberate patience. He needed answers, but more than answers, he needed understanding. He needed to know how deep this deception ran. It was Elena's voice that drew him back from the edge of reason. Light, melodic, and entirely oblivious to the tempest she had unleashed, she hummed softly, turning the pages of her book. She was smiling, a content, unknowing smile, and the sight should have shattered him entirely. Instead, it sharpened the edges of something darker, a seed that had been planted long before the discovery. Revenge. Not immediate, not thoughtless, but precise, calculated, cinematic almost in its inevitability. He thought of Marcus, the man who had shared his triumphs, his failures, the late-night talks that had once felt like a brotherhood. Marcus would pay, not in fury, but in the slow, unbearable unraveling of everything he cherished. Adrian understood the psychological currency of betrayal. He knew that nothing hurt more than watching someone fall into the pit they had dug for another. A plan began to form, taking shape in the quiet of the night. It was methodical, ruthless, and impossibly patient. Step by step, Adrian would expose them, dismantle them, watch as the life he had built crumbled into their laps, but not before they felt every ounce of the pain they had inflicted. The irony would taste sweet, the timing perfect, and yet, even as the storm inside him solidified, doubt crept in, a whisper that threatened to derail the plan before it began. Could he do it? Could a man who once believed in loyalty and love descend into the kind of meticulous vengeance this situation demanded? The answer was in the reflection of the glass staring back at him. Adrian wasn't that man anymore. He was something else entirely, something cold, deliberate, and unflinching. He moved to the bedroom where Elena slept lightly, unaware of the transformation occurring beside her. As he watched her, the weight of betrayal pressed upon him, but so too did the clarity of his resolve. The betrayal had stripped away illusion, leaving only the truth. The perfect life was gone, and only one thing remained: retribution. That night, Adrian made a silent vow. He would not be consumed by the betrayal, nor would he collapse beneath it. He would rise, and when he did, it would be as a force neither Elena nor Marcus could anticipate. And in the quiet shadows of their apartment, amidst the hum of a city that continued to shine in different lights into the darkness, the first stirrings of a meticulously crafted revenge began. By morning, Adrian's demeanor had shifted. The grief and rage had not disappeared, but they were refined, sharpened into a dangerous precision. Each smile he offered, each word he spoke to Elena was measured, calculated, and deliberate. He had become a man who could wait, who could plan, who could deliver consequences with terrifying inevitability. And yet there was one thing Adrian understood better than anything else: revenge, like fire, could not be rushed. It demanded patience, observation, and perfect timing. One wrong move, one spark of emotion, and everything could be ruined. So he waited silently, every heartbeat a metronome counting down to a reckoning they could never see coming. It was not merely the betrayal that defined the night. It was the knowledge that everything they had built on lies would soon crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of calculated justice. Adrian's hands itched for the beginning, the moment when the web he would weave would finally ensnare its targets. But he would wait, for now the night belonged to him, to the quiet fury that simmered beneath his skin, to the dark clarity of what must be done. And as the city slept, oblivious to the storm gathering in one apartment on the 53rd floor, Adrian Cole made one irrevocable decision: he would not be the victim. He would be the architect of their downfall. And when the time came, their world would burn perfectly, inexorably, with him standing at the center. The morning light was cruel in its clarity. It spilled across the hardwood floors, illuminating the meticulous order of the apartment Adrian had shared with Elena for years. To anyone glancing in, it was perfection. Sunlight catching the polished surfaces, the faint scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air, the illusion of domestic bliss as intact as a painted photograph. But Adrian saw through it. He always had. And now, more than ever, he understood how delicate that facade truly was. One wrong touch, one wrong glance, and everything would fracture. He moved quietly, almost ritualistically, through the rooms he once considered safe. Each surface, each object seemed tainted by knowledge he could no longer unsee. He passed Elena's side of the bed, made neatly each morning, and paused only to glance at the small, precise indentation in the pillow where her head had lain. For years he had trusted the shape of her sleep, the rhythm of her breathing. That trust was gone, shattered, and he would not be left unarmed in the ruins of it. The first step, he knew, was observation, not emotional reaction, not impulsive confrontation. Observation was precision, a quiet, calculating attention that left nothing to chance. Adrian spent hours retracing the trails of deceit. He accessed emails that had been carefully hidden, messages deleted but recoverable, accounts that had been masked beneath layers of encryption, all revealing a web far more intricate than he had imagined. Elena and Marcus had not simply shared stolen moments. They had intertwined their lives into a secret network of lies, a shadow world that had siphoned trust, time, and even money from him. The financial implications were staggering. Hidden bank accounts, assets rerouted, investments quietly manipulated. Adrian felt a cold detachment settle over him, an almost clinical fascination with the scale of the betrayal. The irony was exquisite. Marcus, the man he had trusted with the inner workings of his empire, had not only taken a lover but also infiltrated the very foundation of his wealth. And Elena, smiling, breathing, and pretending, had played her role with breathtaking ease. They had assumed he would never notice. That arrogance would soon cost them everything. Adrian's routine became methodical, almost obsessive. Days blended into nights as he mapped transactions, cross-referenced emails, traced locations, and reconstructed patterns of behavior. Each piece of evidence added to the framework of a plan he was only beginning to imagine. His external world remained composed, business meetings executed with flawless precision, colleagues unaware of the turmoil roiling beneath his calm facade. To them, he was the same Adrian Cole, confident, decisive, controlled, but beneath the mask a storm gathered, quiet and inexorable. In parallel, he began testing Elena subtly, planting doubts that would seed fractures in her carefully constructed world. A misplaced document left on the counter, a question asked with casual curiosity, deliberately ambiguous, a glance that hinted at knowledge she assumed he did not possess. Each action was measured, designed to make her second-guess her choices without realizing she was being manipulated. He watched her reactions with the patience of a predator, noting the smallest shifts in posture, the micro-expressions of anxiety barely perceptible but devastatingly revealing. At first, Elena resisted. She was confident, arrogant, even convinced in her own cleverness. But Adrian had learned one thing about people like her: overconfidence was always a weakness. The more she believed she was untouchable, the easier it was to lead her into traps of her own design. He was not impulsive. He was methodical, a surgeon performing intricate work with precision instruments, dissecting the anatomy of trust and deceit. Marcus, too, became a subject of quiet surveillance. Adrian studied the subtle interactions between them, noting how Marcus mirrored her gestures, responded to her cues, and played his part in the unspoken choreography of their affair. The betrayal was mutual, symbiotic, but neither had considered the consequences of underestimating him. He observed without judgment, without rage that would cloud his vision, rage he knew was for the unprepared. Patience, calculation, subtlety, those were the tools of someone who intended to win. The process of gathering evidence was not merely technical, it was psychological warfare. Adrian sent anonymous messages to people in their circle, carefully crafting uncertainty. A friend of Elena's received a vague warning. A colleague of Marcus noticed discrepancies in financial records that could not be ignored. Small cracks appeared, unnoticed at first, but Adrian watched them expand like fissures in glass, knowing that one day they would shatter entirely. Even at home, he became a master of concealment. To Elena, he was composed, even affectionate. His laughter was measured, his conversations casual. No tremor betrayed the tempest beneath. He became the perfect mask, smiling, calm, present, while orchestrating the destruction that would leave them gasping when the inevitable moment arrived. Weeks passed, and the tension between them became almost imperceptible, a static charge in the air. Elena began to notice minor anomalies, small inconsistencies in the lives she thought were hers to command. Perhaps it was a misplaced receipt, a subtle omission, a comment that seemed innocuous but struck a nerve. She began questioning, albeit subtly, though she would never admit it aloud. Adrian, of course, watched these seeds take root, knowing that once doubt grew, the psychological unraveling would follow naturally. The social calendar became another arena. Invitations to galas, charity events, and high society gatherings presented opportunities for observation, testing, and subtle exposure. Adrian prepared meticulously, selecting attire that exuded casual perfection, ensuring every detail was impeccable. It was a performance, a display of control that masked the storm of his plotting beneath layers of charm and poise. Elena remained unaware that every laugh, every glance exchanged at these gatherings was being recorded in his mind, catalogued for future use. The gala arrived, an elegant affair in the grand hall of a downtown hotel. Chandeliers glimmered like captured stars, and the room was filled with the hum of conversation, the soft clinking of glasses, and the faint intoxicating scent of expensive perfume. Elena moved through the crowd with ease, radiating confidence, laughing in the perfect cadence of a woman convinced she was untouchable. Adrian followed, silent, observant, noting the smallest gestures, the tilt of her head, the subtle flicker of her eyes when Marcus approached, the ease with which she navigated deception and charm alike. He did not confront, not yet, there was no need. The spectacle itself was a weapon. Adrian watched as Elena, in her arrogance, revealed pieces of herself that were unintended, cracks in the armor that he had only begun to expose. He noted every smile that was too bright, every word that lingered too long, every glance that betrayed unearned confidence. Even as the music swelled and the crowd laughed, Adrian's mind remained coldly analytical. He traced the connections, the interactions, the unspoken communications, mapping a mental blueprint that would later dictate the collapse of her world. And as the night unfolded, he realized something essential. The mask Elena wore, the mask she believed protected her, was beginning to slip. Not because of confrontation or accusation, but because of him, invisible yet omnipresent, patient, and precise. The evening ended with a toast, laughter, and applause. Elena smiled, radiant, confident, completely unaware that the very foundation of her life was being catalogued, analyzed, and prepared for demolition. Adrian remained beside her, the perfect companion, while inside his mind moved faster than the music, faster than the conversations, faster than the shallow joy surrounding them. Each step she took, each word she spoke, each connection she believed to be safe, was a thread he would later pull with devastating effect. By the time they returned home, the city lights a blur beneath the speeding car. Adrian felt the quiet satisfaction of a chess player positioning his pieces. Elena drifted to sleep, exhausted from her performance, oblivious that a new player had entered the game, a silent, patient adversary who had already begun to dictate the moves she thought were hers. And as Adrian looked at her sleeping form, serene and unknowing, he allowed a small, private smile. The mask she wore, the life she believed secure, was slipping, and he was holding the key. The night settled around them, a quiet accomplice to the storm brewing beneath Adrian's calm exterior. Outside, the city pulsed with light and sound, unaware that in a single apartment a battle of minds, deception, and revenge had begun, a war that would leave neither side unchanged, and that would escalate far beyond what Elena or Marcus could imagine. Adrian had learned early in life that power was rarely won through confrontation. It was earned quietly, measured in subtle movements, in the invisible currents beneath a seemingly placid surface. And now, as he sat in his study, the glow of a single desk lamp illuminating the carefully organized files before him, he realized that this truth applied equally to revenge. Confrontation was for the unprepared, for those who allowed emotion to dictate action. But Adrian was no longer the man who had lived through complacency. He had been stripped bare by betrayal, refined by pain, and sharpened by the cold clarity of purpose. Elena and Marcus were arrogant. They assumed their confidence shielded them, their overreach excused by a sense of invincibility. And arrogance, Adrian knew, was a dangerous weakness. It left people blind to the small, precise disruptions that could shatter their world. They were predators in their own right, yet they had overlooked one essential truth: Adrian was no longer prey. He had become the hunter. He began with small, almost imperceptible acts of sabotage. To Elena, he introduced subtle inconsistencies that undermined her sense of security. A friend would mention something Elena had claimed she never did. An acquaintance would bring up a vague rumor, untraceable, yet lingering, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. The goal was not to provoke confrontation, but to sow unease, to allow her mind to begin questioning itself, to turn her overconfidence into an internal struggle. Marcus proved a different challenge. He was cautious in the realm of finances, meticulous in the details that Adrian had once admired. But greed, Adrian had learned, was an insidious force. It blinded even the most careful of men, and it left them vulnerable to subtle manipulations. Adrian began leaking small pieces of information, documents hinting at discrepancies in Marcus's accounts, anonymous tips about misappropriated funds, carefully worded insinuations sent to associates who trusted Marcus but not blindly. The goal was not exposure yet, it was doubt, unease, a creeping paranoia that would make Marcus question every alliance, every transaction, every loyalty. And the genius of these manipulations lay in their invisibility. Adrian did not confront, he did not accuse, he did not act rashly. Instead, he became a ghost in their lives, invisible yet omnipresent, guiding the narrative in ways they could not perceive. Elena began to hesitate in conversations, pausing in moments of decision that once would have been effortless. Marcus found himself double-checking numbers, rereading contracts, questioning assumptions he had previously taken for granted. Every ripple Adrian created expanded slowly, subtly, until it became impossible to ignore. It was during this delicate orchestration that Clara entered the equation. She was a quiet, unassuming woman who had worked under Marcus for years, privy to his dealings and Elena's hidden influence. Adrian recognized immediately the potential leverage she represented. With a combination of subtle charm and careful persuasion, he approached her, presenting himself not as an avenger but as a concerned observer, a neutral party curious about anomalies she might have noticed. Clara was hesitant, naturally so. She had witnessed the ruthlessness of both Elena and Marcus and was unwilling to entangle herself in another conflict. But Adrian, patient and methodical, created a scenario in which her cooperation became inevitable. A misplaced file, a hint of exposure, and the knowledge that Adrian's awareness of her insider position was complete made refusal. By the time she agreed, reluctantly, to provide him with information, Adrian had already secured a critical advantage. Clara's insights allowed him to anticipate moves, understand motivations, and manipulate outcomes with far greater precision. The real thrill, however, came from the psychological manipulation itself. Adrian began to watch the interactions between Elena and Marcus, noting how his invisible presence began to influence their decisions. They did not know he was orchestrating their uncertainty. They could not perceive the threads he had woven. And yet every slight hesitation, every flicker of suspicion, every momentary doubt was a testament to the power of a mind honed by betrayal. One evening, as he observed from a distance, Adrian caught Elena in a moment of subtle recognition. She paused mid-laughter, her gaze flickering in his direction. For a heartbeat, her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion of him specifically, but in unease, a subconscious awareness that something was amiss. Adrian froze, blending into the shadowed corner of the room, allowing the moment to pass without acknowledgement. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the exhilaration of near discovery. She had sensed the invisible hand guiding her discomfort, and it thrilled him. The game was escalating, and she did not even know it had begun. Marcus, too, was showing signs of fraying nerves. The anonymous documents, the pointed rumors, and the inconsistencies Adrian had planted had begun to gnaw at his confidence. Meetings that had once proceeded smoothly were now riddled with hesitation. He questioned subordinates, repeated calculations, and even second-guessed Elena's reassurances. Adrian observed all of this with the clinical fascination of a scientist watching a controlled experiment unfold. Every action, every reaction was data to be used, a thread to be pulled in the moment of final collapse. Adrian understood that timing was everything. There was no rush. The seed of doubt must germinate fully, root itself deep, before the harvest could be reaped. Patience was not passive, it was active, deliberate, and meticulous. And so he continued, weaving a tapestry of subtle unease, of invisible pressure, until the foundation of their confidence began to tremble. Then came the accident, or at least the accident as the world would see it. Adrian had noticed Marcus's growing reliance on his private driver, a man who was dependable but not infallible. On a routine evening, Adrian orchestrated a minor disruption, a slick patch of oil left on the entrance ramp, a subtle distraction for the driver at precisely the right moment. Nothing overtly dangerous, nothing lethal. Yet when the car skidded slightly and Marcus gripped the wheel with visible tension, the first cracks in his composed exterior appeared. A simple, minor mishap, but the effect was devastating. Marcus's confidence, already eroded by Adrian's careful manipulations, wavered. He became cautious, hesitant, paranoid. Adrian noted every micro-expression, every shift in posture, every involuntary gesture. The psychological impact was profound. Elena, observing Marcus's sudden unease, began to worry, not about the accident itself, but about the undercurrent of instability she could feel but could not name. Adrian's invisible hand guided her discomfort, amplified it, ensured it spread like a virus. The couple, who had believed themselves untouchable, were now subtly unraveling from within. Adrian's satisfaction was quiet but intense. The seeds he had planted were beginning to sprout. Days turned into weeks, and the campaign of quiet manipulation continued. Adrian maintained the perfect outward composure, attending to business, hosting family dinners, engaging with colleagues, all while orchestrating the invisible collapse of the life that had once seemed unassailable. Every whisper, every hint, every small act of disruption fed into a larger mosaic of psychological torment, a meticulous choreography designed to leave Elena and Marcus exposed, vulnerable, and ultimately defeated. Clara's reluctant assistance proved invaluable. She provided insights into Marcus's hidden dealings, the subtle cracks in his decision-making, and the vulnerabilities that Adrian could exploit. She watched with a mixture of fear and fascination as Adrian moved through the shadows of their lives, transforming quiet observation into a weapon of precise, devastating power. Adrian, in turn, ensured she understood her role, but never her reward, keeping her tethered to his will without revealing the full scope of his strategy. Ryan. By the time another gala approached, a high-profile event attended by both business elites and social luminaries, Adrian's campaign had reached a new level of intensity. He prepared meticulously, selecting attire that conveyed effortless sophistication, ensuring his demeanor projected calm authority. Elena, radiant and unaware, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, confident in the perfection of her performance. Marcus, on edge but hiding it, mirrored her movements, on edge but hiding it, mirrored herself, unaware that the invisible strings tightening around them were orchestrated entirely by the man they had betrayed. At the gala, Adrian observed, cataloging every movement, every smile, every gesture. He noted how Elena's arrogance subtly shifted into overcompensation, how Marcus's confidence trembled at the slightest provocation. The seeds of doubt had taken root. They would not recognize the hand guiding their discomfort, but they would feel it, unrelenting, inescapable. Adrian's satisfaction was private, imperceptible, yet absolute. The night closed with a delicate crescendo. Elena, flushed with the triumph of social dominance, failed to notice the subtle glances, the whispered reassurances, the small moments of hesitation that now punctuated her interactions. Marcus, meanwhile, moved with careful calculation, yet every action was filtered through the prism of doubt Adrian had inserted into his consciousness. And Adrian, ever patient, retreated into the shadows, letting the game unfold exactly as he had planned. The seeds had been planted, the doubts had taken root, and the silent war had begun. One minor accident, one carefully timed whisper, one imperceptible nudge had set in motion a chain of events that would lead Elena and Marcus inexorably toward the moment of reckoning. Adrian did not rush. He would wait, calculating every move, every consequence, ensuring that when the collapse came, it would be complete, devastating, and undeniable. And as he returned home that night, walking through the quiet halls of the apartment he had once shared with love and trust, Adrian allowed himself a brief, private reflection. The mask of composure he wore outwardly concealed a mind alight with strategy, patience, and precision. The game was no longer theoretical. The pieces were in motion. And soon, very soon, the world of Elena and Marcus would begin to crack, not from the force of confrontation, but from the silent, invisible pressure of doubt expertly delivered and carefully nurtured. Arman had always believed he knew the boundaries of his life. He thought he understood loyalty, trust, and the intricate balance of relationships that formed the foundation of his world. But betrayal is a teacher that leaves scars deeper than any lesson learned through caution or experience. Sarah had shattered that illusion. The discovery of her deceit was only the beginning. Now the truth demanded action, not explosive confrontation, but quiet infiltration, patient observation, and meticulous strategy. The first step was to understand the ecosystem that enabled her. People rarely act alone in such betrayals. Friends, colleagues, confidants, even family. Each could be a cog in the machinery of deceit, intentionally or unwittingly supporting the treachery. Arman began his investigation with a precision that bordered on obsession. He documented every interaction, every recurring pattern, every person who might play a role in sustaining Sarah's double life. It was exhausting work. Days blurred into nights as he pored over social media accounts, scrutinized photographs for subtle hints, and pieced together schedules that revealed where Sarah went, who she met, and how often she lied. He discovered small, seemingly insignificant details that painted a picture more damning than any confrontation could achieve. A friend who just happened to be at the same cafe as Sarah at odd hours. A colleague who always seemed to cover for her absences. Even family members, who thought their complicity was invisible, provided clues through offhand remarks and subtle encouragements. The deeper he delved, the more he realized how elaborate her world of lies truly was. Sarah had built a network of enablers, a support system that allowed her betrayal to flourish without detection. Each person played a role, whether knowingly or not, reinforcing her illusion of control. And Arman, who had once felt powerless, now felt the thrill of opportunity coursing through him. He would enter this world not as a naive observer, but as a strategist, manipulating its threads with care, precision, and patience. Maya was the first breakthrough. She was a friend of Sarah's, outwardly loyal and seemingly unquestioning, but Arman had sensed undercurrents of doubt in her demeanor. Through careful observation, subtle conversations, and a few strategically placed suggestions, he discovered that Maya, too, harbored a quiet suspicion about Sarah. The discovery was invaluable. Here was an insider, willing though cautious to cooperate, a conduit into Sarah's private world without raising alarm. Building trust with Maya was an exercise in delicacy. Armin could not reveal his full intentions. That would have destroyed the fragile alliance before it began. Instead, he presented himself as a concerned observer, a man seeking clarity about inconsistencies in Sarah's behavior that he had noticed. Maya, wary at first, eventually began to provide information, small, seemingly mundane details that, when combined, formed a map of Sarah's interactions, her habits, and the vulnerabilities that Armin could exploit. The danger was ever present. One misstep, one misjudged word could expose him entirely. Armin moved carefully, navigating conversations and encounters with the precision of a tightrope walker. Each step was calculated, each interaction deliberate. He learned to read body language, micro-expressions, and tone of voice with a surgeon's precision. Trust was fragile, suspicion was abundant, and he knew the moment he was discovered, the game would end not in victory but in defeat. Observation alone, however, was not enough. Armin needed to experience Sarah's world firsthand, to understand the dynamics from within, to see how she maneuvered her lies in real time. This required immersion, stepping into a social sphere that was not his own, adopting disguises, and attending gatherings where his presence would raise no questions yet allow him to witness her in action. The first test came in the form of a lavish evening event, a gathering of friends and colleagues that Sarah had invited him to attend ostensibly as her partner. He declined politely, knowing that attending as himself would immediately arouse suspicion. Instead, he crafted an alternate identity, adopting a persona that allowed him to move through the crowd unnoticed. Subtle changes in attire, posture, and mannerisms rendered him invisible to those who would otherwise recognize him. In this guise, he could watch, listen, and analyze without fear of exposure. At the event, Sarah was radiant, confident, and oblivious to the web forming around her. She laughed easily, mingled effortlessly, and projected the aura of a woman in complete control. But Armin noticed cracks beneath the surface, small, fleeting signs of insecurity that her overconfidence could not fully mask. A hesitant glance here, a brief pause in conversation there, and moments where her composure faltered ever so slightly. These were the openings he had been searching for. He observed interactions meticulously. Friends who nodded a little too quickly, colleagues who avoided her eyes, family members who spoke in hushed tones, all revealed a pattern of subtle influence, a network of complicity. Armin catalogued each nuance in his mind, building a mental blueprint that would later guide his manipulations. Every smile, every gesture, every word exchanged was data, waiting to be transformed into leverage. Even Maya's role proved invaluable. She whispered insights that Sarah would never reveal to anyone, details of meetings, moods, and secrets. Through her, Armin learned which friends were pliable, which colleagues could be manipulated, and which family members were susceptible to suggestion. Each piece of information enhanced his ability to predict Sarah's behavior and exploit it with precision. Tension escalated as Armin navigated this dangerous game. One evening, while observing Sarah at a dinner party from a shadowed corner of the room, he sensed her gaze flicker toward him. For a brief moment he froze, heart racing, knowing that detection would unravel everything. But it was fleeting. Sarah's attention moved elsewhere, and he allowed himself to exhale, inwardly exhilarated by the narrow escape. The brush with discovery heightened the stakes, intensifying the thrill of manipulation, reminding him of the razor's edge upon which he balanced. Armin's understanding of Sarah's world extended beyond her immediate social circle. He began mapping her routines, noting the timings of meetings, the frequency of private calls, and the places she frequented to conceal her activities. Each observation was cataloged, cross-referenced, and analyzed. He discovered allies who unwittingly enabled her betrayal, from a colleague who covered for her absences to a family member who had silently validated her secret excursions. Every connection was a thread he could pull, a lever he could use to unravel the carefully constructed facade. And the infiltration extended further than social gatherings. Armin learned to navigate the subtle hierarchies and alliances within Sarah's circle. He observed how influence was wielded, how information flowed, and how trust was manipulated. With Maya's guidance, he identified key players whose cooperation, when secured or disrupted, could amplify the psychological pressure he intended to exert. The intricate web of Sarah's world became a landscape for strategic exploitation, a map for the precise application of doubt, fear, and uncertainty. Then came the moment of tactical application. Armin orchestrated a minor incident, seemingly trivial but psychologically potent. A misplaced item, a subtly altered schedule, an innocuous comment strategically placed, small nudges designed to provoke unease, to disrupt the seamless confidence Sarah relied upon. The effect was immediate and satisfying. Sarah's composure wavered just enough to reveal the vulnerabilities he had been searching for, the fissures that would later allow the full force of his revenge to take root. By the end of the evening, Armin had gathered more than information. He had observed patterns, identified weaknesses, and confirmed the effectiveness of his initial manipulations. Sarah, radiant and unknowing, remained convinced of her invulnerability, while he, invisible yet omnipresent, had begun to weave the threads of doubt and disruption into the fabric of her life. Stram, furs, each act, each observation, each subtle influence was a step closer to the day when, the carefully constructed world she believed secure would crumble around her. Returning home, Armin reflected on the day's efforts with a cold satisfaction. He had entered Sarah's world, navigated its complexities, and emerged with a comprehensive understanding of its vulnerabilities. Maya's alliance had proven crucial, the minor incident had tested his influence successfully, and Sarah's own overconfidence was beginning to work against her. He allowed himself a brief moment of private triumph before retreating to the quiet, methodical planning that defined his obsession. Outside, the city pulsed with life, unaware that within one apartment, a silent strategist had infiltrated a seemingly perfect world of deception. Every connection, every relationship, every trusted friend and family member had been observed, analyzed, and catalogued. Armin had become a ghost within Sarah's reality, invisible yet unstoppable, patient yet relentless, ready to convert knowledge into power, observation into leverage. The night settled around him, a companion to his meticulous plotting. In the shadows of the city, in the quiet moments before dawn, Armin allowed himself one certainty, the seeds had been planted. Sarah's world, built on lies and betrayal, was beginning to crack. And when the fractures widened, when her carefully cultivated facade finally collapsed, he would be ready to step forward, not as the betrayed, not as the victim, but as the architect of their reckoning. Adrian had always understood that trust was fragile, a delicate thread stretched taut across the abyss of human ambition. In the controlled environment of his mind, trust was calculated, measured, and wielded carefully. He had trusted Clara, the insider, who had become an unlikely ally, believing her caution, her fear, and her reluctant cooperation could be channeled to serve his purpose. But betrayal, he realized once again, lurks in the unlikeliest corners. Even those aligned with him could falter, could waver, could endanger everything he had painstakingly built. The first hint came in an email, a subtle misstep, almost imperceptible, that suggested Clara had shared information she shouldn't have. Adrian noticed the irregularities immediately, the timestamps, the phrasing, the patterns that betrayed someone acting under pressure. It wasn't an outright disclosure, but it was enough to suggest that she had come close to compromising him. A momentary lapse, a fleeting doubt, and his meticulously crafted web could unravel entirely. Adrian's pulse remained steady, his expression calm, yet internally, a storm of calculation took form. Clara's betrayal was not an ending. It was an opportunity. She had exposed herself not as a villain but as a tool, a variable in a system that Adrian now had to adjust with precision. He would not confront her, not yet. Instead, he recalibrated, assessing the scope of the exposure, predicting the consequences, and planning contingencies. Every weakness she revealed could be transformed into leverage, every misstep into a means of tightening his control. And meanwhile, the dynamics between Elena and Marcus were shifting in ways Adrian had anticipated but could now observe with keen interest. Elena, sensing cracks in Marcus's confidence from his earlier mishaps and her own growing anxiety, began manipulating him in turn. She fed him carefully chosen false information, created scenarios that tested his trust, and subtly undermined the fragile balance he thought he maintained. The chaos was escalating, and Adrian watched from the shadows, unseen but omnipresent, understanding that the interplay of betrayal, mistrust, and overconfidence was a force more powerful than direct confrontation ever could be. Adrian's approach remained the same, patient, precise, and deliberate. He allowed the tension to rise naturally, observing how the newly introduced layer of chaos, Clara's near betrayal, Elena's manipulations, affected the behavior of his targets. The instability created openings, opportunities he could exploit without ever revealing his own hand. He became a master of misdirection, turning potential threats into instruments of control, transforming risk into strategic advantage. Clara, realizing her error, approached Adrian with fear masked as contrition. She claimed her misstep had been unintentional, a moment of panic under pressure, and offered information to regain his trust. Adrian accepted it silently, but internally, he cataloged every nuance of her demeanor, the hesitation in her speech, the micro-expressions that betrayed both fear and guilt. He knew that the balance of power had shifted slightly, but only temporarily. With careful guidance, he could ensure that Clara remained valuable, contained, and ultimately complicit in her own redemption. Elena's maneuvers were more challenging. She sensed the growing pressure, the subtle manipulations around her, and she began acting with a desperate cunning that caught even Adrian's attention. She manipulated Marcus with skill, exploiting his anxieties, amplifying his doubts, and subtly steering decisions that would later play into Adrian's hands. Each time she acted, she exposed vulnerabilities, revealed motivations, and left traces that Adrian could observe and document. Her arrogance, combined with fear, created a volatility that was perfect for the final act. Adrian's challenge was to maintain invisibility amidst this increasing chaos. Every misstep on his part could expose him. Every poorly timed action could unravel months of preparation. He moved with the patience of a chess grandmaster, ensuring that every advance was measured, every observation discreet, every intervention imperceptible. He became the invisible hand shaping events from the shadows, turning betrayal into a tool, chaos into opportunity, and doubt into an instrument of power. The psychological tension escalated further when Adrian orchestrated minor disruptions designed to test Elena and Marcus. A misfiled document here, an ambiguous note there, and subtle suggestions of betrayal spread like whispers through their social and professional circles. Elena's attempts to manipulate Marcus became more frantic, her overconfidence now working against her, while Marcus's anxiety magnified, leaving him increasingly vulnerable to Adrian's guidance. Each move was invisible, yet potent, a thread pulled in a tapestry that neither of them could yet comprehend. Adrian also began to observe the interplay between Clara and Elena, noting how subtle alliances and enmities formed without either realizing his influence. Clara, though fearful, provided Adrian with insight into Elena's strategies, revealing how she attempted to control perceptions, manipulate outcomes, and shield her own secrets. This intelligence allowed Adrian to preempt moves, anticipate reactions, and position his own interventions with surgical precision. In one particularly tense moment, Adrian narrowly avoided exposure. Elena, sensing a presence she could not identify, paused mid-conversation at a gathering, her eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that made his stomach tighten, not with fear, but with calculated awareness. He blended seamlessly into the environment, a shadow among shadows, and allowed the moment to pass. The near detection reinforced the importance of patience, of timing, of invisibility. One false step, one visible intention, and the carefully constructed plan could collapse. The minor incident he orchestrated next was deceptively simple but psychologically effective. Marcus was led to believe that a critical decision had been compromised, a business opportunity jeopardized. The disruption was subtle, a minor financial miscommunication that could have been dismissed, but Adrian had layered it with enough ambiguity to provoke uncertainty, hesitation, and anxiety. Marcus's confidence wavered, Elena's manipulations became more desperate, and the cracks in their seemingly perfect coordination widened perceptibly. Adrian's mastery lay in his ability to use betrayal as a tool. Clara's lapse, Elena's desperation, Marcus's faltering confidence, they were all ingredients in a complex recipe that Adrian refined continually. He had become the architect of psychological chaos, a strategist who transformed potential threats into instruments of control, turning instability into leverage and mistrust into inevitability. The culmination of these efforts required careful staging. Adrian began arranging situations where the interplay of secrets, lies, and manipulations would converge. Each revelation, each exposure would be timed to maximize impact, ensuring that when the final confrontation arrived, it would be not merely dramatic, but catastrophic. He cataloged every secret, every misstep, every moment of vulnerability, weaving them into a coherent framework that promised devastation at the perfect moment. By the end of the chapter, Adrian had achieved clarity. Clara was contained, her loyalty now subtly intertwined with his own designs. Elena's desperation had been observed, documented, and partially guided. Marcus's faltering confidence had created cracks in their alliance, making them susceptible to the subtle manipulations Adrian had been orchestrating. Every element was in place for the crescendo, the moment when secrets, lies, and betrayals would explode in a calculated spectacle of psychological and emotional impact. Alone in his apartment, Adrian allowed himself a private moment of satisfaction. He reflected on the delicate balance he had maintained, the near betrayals navigated, and the precision required to manipulate multiple layers of deceit without ever revealing his hand. The web he had spun was intricate, vulnerable, and perfect in its timing. He understood that one misstep could undo months of meticulous planning, yet he also knew that patience, observation, and calculated action would secure his triumph. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware of the silent war unfolding within a single apartment. The lives of Elena, Marcus, and Clara were now entangled in a complex network of manipulation, doubt, and psychological pressure. Adrian, calm, composed, and invisible, had transformed potential chaos into opportunity, betrayal into leverage, and observation into power. The stage was set, the pieces were positioned, and when the moment of confrontation arrived, Adrian would ensure that every secret, every betrayal, every carefully nurtured doubt would ignite in perfect, devastating sequence. The final act, he knew, would not be mere revenge. It would be a reckoning precise, inescapable, and unforgettable. The air in the city felt different that evening, heavy with anticipation, though no one could yet name the source. Adrian moved through it with quiet certainty, the culmination of months of observation, manipulation, and patience finally coalescing into a singular, devastating purpose. Every calculated step, every subtle nudge, every piece of information had led to this night, the final act, the ultimate exposure. He had rehearsed it in his mind countless times, visualizing how each element would unfold, how Elena and Marcus would react, how their carefully constructed facades would crumble before a public audience, and how the silent witnesses, friends, colleagues, family, would absorb the revelation with stunned disbelief. The plan was not just revenge. It was theater, and Adrian was the conductor of a symphony composed entirely of deceit, betrayal, and revelation. Evening began innocuously. A gala, the kind where wealth and influence mingled effortlessly, and where Elena and Marcus thrived on public admiration. They arrived radiating confidence, unaware that the very world they sought to impress was about to turn against them in a way that would leave them exposed, humiliated, and Adrian, dressed impeccably, moved through the crowd with a calm detachment, his presence unnoticed, his intentions invisible. Every detail had been perfected, the timing, the placement of key players, the release of information, the witnesses who would confirm the truth so carefully concealed. The first act of exposure was subtle, almost imperceptible. As Elena mingled, Adrian orchestrated a series of private messages to friends, colleagues, and influential contacts who had previously been shielded from the truth. The messages were concise, damning, and verifiable, photos, documents, and recordings that confirmed the web of deceit and betrayal that she had spun. Within moments, whispers began to circulate, a quiet hum of suspicion that quickly grew into audible concern. Elena's smile faltered, imperceptibly at first, as she sensed the shift in the room. Marcus was next. Adrian had cultivated the perfect conditions for his collapse. Financial irregularities, minor scandals, and personal betrayals that Adrian had meticulously documented were now unleashed simultaneously. Associates, previously loyal or unaware, received the compiled evidence in real time, each piece undeniable, each revelation perfectly timed to maximize confusion and anxiety. Marcus's confidence, which had already been eroded by Adrian's subtle manipulations, faltered visibly. His gestures became defensive, his voice sharp and brittle, and the once commanding presence he projected began to crumble before an audience who had been quietly observing the unraveling. Adrian's movements were deliberate. He positioned himself strategically, observing the reactions of those around him, ensuring that every revelation had the desired impact. Elena's panic began to show, a twitch in her jaw, a nervous glance toward Marcus, a tightening of her posture. She realized too late that the carefully curated illusion of control she had maintained was disintegrating in front of her eyes. Every lie, every betrayal, every hidden financial maneuver, every affair, each layer of deception was being peeled back, exposed not by accusation, but by the undeniable clarity of evidence. The psychological impact was devastating. Friends whispered, colleagues questioned, and even family members could no longer ignore the truth. Elena and Marcus attempted damage control, but their efforts were fragmented, reactive, and entirely ineffective. The tide of public scrutiny had shifted irrevocably, and Adrian's orchestration ensured that no single defensive move could reverse the momentum. It was not just revenge, it was justice executed with the precision of a master strategist, ensuring that every misdeed was illuminated and every betrayal recognized. Amidst the chaos, Adrian allowed himself to reflect briefly on the nature of his triumph. The satisfaction of seeing Elena and Marcus exposed was tempered by a quiet awareness of the cost. Revenge is rarely clean, it is rarely without consequence. He had orchestrated the perfect public humiliation, dismantled their empire, and ensured their downfall, but the process had left marks on him as well. Trust, once shattered, cannot be fully restored. The scars of betrayal linger, and the act of revenge, no matter how meticulously executed, reshapes the avenger as much as the victim. Adrian watched Elena's collapse in real time, her composure unraveling with breathtaking speed. She tried to confront him, scanning the crowd, seeking an unseen hand responsible for her undoing. Marcus, too, attempted to regain authority, but each step he took was undermined by the evidence Adrian had unleashed. The audience, silent but attentive, absorbed every nuance. The shock, the disbelief, the anger, and the helplessness. It was a psychological spectacle, a public reckoning that left no room for denial. The beauty of Adrian's plan lay not just in exposure, but in its orchestration. The revelations were delivered in a sequence that maximized emotional and psychological impact. Initial whispers created doubt, followed by incontrovertible evidence that shattered denial, culminating in a cascade of personal, financial, and relational betrayals that left Elena and Marcus exposed in every dimension of their lives. Adrian's patient calculations had turned chaos into art, and the unfolding spectacle was as satisfying as it was inevitable. And Clara's role was pivotal. Her contributions, once hesitant, had been carefully managed to avoid compromise, while providing Adrian with the intelligence required to manipulate outcomes in real time. She had become, unwittingly, a part of the final act, a conduit through which information could flow to ensure maximum exposure without revealing Adrian's direct involvement. It was a delicate balance, one that Adrian had maintained with unwavering focus, and it had paid off spectacularly. As the evening drew on, Adrian ensured that every revelation reached the right audience at the right moment. Social media feeds, private messages, and subtle public acknowledgments converged to amplify the psychological impact. Elena and Marcus were not merely humiliated, they were dismantled. Friends turned skeptical, colleagues withdrew support, and financial backers reconsidered commitments. Their empire, once seemingly untouchable, now lay exposed, fragile, and crumbling under the weight of truth. The climax of the evening came with a public acknowledgment of the deception. Adrian, invisible in plain sight, watched as Elena and Marcus were confronted by their peers with the evidence he had orchestrated. Their reactions, shock, denial, rage, and finally resignation, were all perfectly predicted. Adrian had timed every element so that the confrontation was unavoidable, undeniable, and utterly devastating. The precision of his planning ensured that the psychological impact was complete, leaving no opportunity for escape or recovery. Yet even in victory, Adrian felt the weight of what he had done. Revenge is rarely a path that leaves the avenger unscathed. The satisfaction of seeing justice served, of witnessing the collapse of the betrayers, was intertwined with an awareness of the personal cost. Trust, once violated, cannot be restored. Relationships are forever altered, and the mind of the avenger bears the burden of meticulous, prolonged manipulation. Adrian understood, in that quiet moment of triumph, that he had changed as profoundly as those he had punished. As the gala concluded, Adrian walked through the emptying halls with quiet composure, observing the aftermath. Elena and Marcus, broken, humiliated, and exposed, retreated into the shadows of their former lives. The empire they had built on deception and arrogance had been dismantled, and every observer had witnessed the finality of their reckoning. Adrian's satisfaction was private, internal, tempered by the knowledge that the path to this moment had demanded patience, cunning, and the careful orchestration of every detail. In the solitude of his apartment that night, Adrian reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Betrayal, observation, manipulation, and psychological precision had all converged in this moment of resolution. The public humiliation of Elena and Marcus was complete, undeniable, and devastating, but it was also a mirror reflecting the emotional cost of his own obsession. Revenge had been achieved, but at a price that could not be quantified: the loss of innocence, the erosion of trust, and the permanent imprint of calculated violence upon his psyche. And yet, amid the reflection, there was clarity. Adrian had regained control, restored balance, and ensured that the betrayals committed against him would be remembered, examined, and understood in full measure. He had executed the ultimate move, turning chaos into art, betrayal into opportunity, and patient observation into absolute power. The city outside continued to pulse with life, oblivious to the quiet genius who had orchestrated a symphony of ruin and revelation from within its heart. But Adrian allowed himself one final glance at the empty halls of the apartment that had once been a sanctuary of trust and love. The echoes of betrayal lingered, the scars of deception remained, and the memory of the pain he had endured would stay with him forever. But the world he had rebuilt, silent, precise, and victorious, was now his. Elena and Marcus, humiliated beyond repair, were left to reckon with the consequences of their choices, while Adrian, though changed, had ensured that justice, in its cold, unrelenting form, had been served. The night ended not with celebration, but with quiet vindication. Adrian had executed the final move, and the reverberations of his strategy would linger far beyond the evening. Every secret had been revealed, every betrayal had been punished, and though the personal cost was undeniable, the clarity of his triumph was absolute. He was victorious, not merely in exposing deceit, but in mastering the psychological terrain that had once held him captive, turning manipulation into justice, observation into power, and patient calculation into ultimate revenge. The city felt quieter now, or perhaps Adrian only perceived it that way. The constant buzz of social life, once overwhelming and impossible to ignore, had softened into a distant hum. It was as if the world itself had paused, acknowledging the chain of events he had set in motion. Elena and Marcus, once admired for their confidence and public poise, now moved like shadows through the city they once dominated. Their influence had thinned, their reputations shaken. What was once a fortress of charm and certainty had fractured under the weight of their own choices, leaving them exposed in ways neither had imagined. Adrian stood by the window of his apartment, watching the streetlights glimmer against the pavement below. He exhaled slowly, purposefully. What he had uncovered, revealed, and confronted was done. The truth, once buried beneath layers of charm and deception, had finally surfaced. The sense of resolution was real, even powerful, but it carried a quiet heaviness he couldn't ignore. Revealing the truth had changed him too, reshaping his understanding of trust, loyalty, and the fragile nature of human relationships. Elena's fall from grace had been the most visible. People who once echoed her every opinion now kept their distance. Conversations silenced themselves as she approached. Her polished confidence had dimmed, replaced by an awareness she had never possessed before. Marcus, shaken by the exposure of his own actions, had withdrawn into long stretches of solitude, wrestling with the consequences that had followed him like a shadow. Adrian noticed everything: the small tremor in Elena's hands when she thought no one was watching, opters, the way Marcus paused before speaking as if unsure of his own voice. These were not victories. They were reminders of what truth can undo, and how far its impact can ripple through the lives it touches. Kank. Walking through his apartment, Adrian traced his fingers along objects that once symbolized comfort and connection. Now they felt like artifacts from a life he no longer inhabited. Photographs, keepsakes, familiar corners, all carried the echo of what had changed. The silence inside the room pressed gently around him, not threatening but reflective. It invited him to acknowledge what he had gained, what he had lost, and what could never return to the way it once was. In that stillness, Adrian recognized something profound. Truth can bring closure, but it can also demand introspection. What had happened had reshaped all of them, including him, and while the storm had passed, its imprint remained, urging him to step forward not with triumph but with understanding. Clara, whose tentative loyalty had once been tested and now secured, had disappeared from Adrian's immediate world. He had ensured her safety, her cooperation, and her complicity, but he understood that she, too, bore a subtle mark from their shared endeavor. The alliances formed in secrecy, the strategies executed in shadows, and the mutual understanding of complicity left traces impossible to erase. She had been both instrument and witness, and her presence, or absence, was a reminder of how entwined the act of revenge had made them all. Elena, in her solitude, grappled with the impossibility of her own arrogance. She had believed herself untouchable, impervious to consequence. But exposure had stripped her of control, leaving a vulnerability she had never experienced. Every social interaction was now a gauntlet, every glance a judgment, and every whisper a reminder of her downfall. The humbling was not merely public, it was internal, a relentless psychological pressure that Adrian had orchestrated with precision. Marcus, meanwhile, oscillated between anger and despair. The minor cracks Adrian had exploited had widened into chasms, leaving him incapable of decisive action. His attempts to regain influence were met with skepticism, resistance, and the unyielding judgment of those who had once deferred to him. He was a man reduced not merely by exposure but by the subtle, unrelenting erosion of confidence Adrian had cultivated over months. His empire, once a fortress of power, now stood as a monument to miscalculated arrogance and misplaced trust. Adrian did not intervene further. He watched silently as the consequences of his actions unfolded naturally. He understood that the finality of revenge does not require direct involvement. It requires precision, timing, and the invisible hand of orchestration. The psychological fractures he had introduced were sufficient to dismantle their world completely. And yet, as he observed, he felt an unfamiliar emptiness. Victory was complete, undeniable, but it was also profoundly isolating. He had regained control, but at the cost of the emotional scaffolding that had once sustained him. The city outside continued in its oblivious rhythm, a stark contrast to the personal catastrophes Adrian had engineered. He walked to the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his face, and allowed his mind to wander over the months of careful observation, subtle manipulations, and orchestrated events. Each act of revenge, executed flawlessly, had been a triumph of patience, strategy, and psychological acuity. Yet each act had also exacted a toll, embedding within him a quiet, persistent solitude that no victory could erase. Adrian's reflection turned inward. Justice had been served, but at what cost? He had become something new, someone capable of extraordinary patience, meticulous calculation, and profound psychological insight, but also someone marked by obsession, distrust, and the haunting knowledge that betrayal leaves scars not only on the victim, but on the avenger. The line between righteousness and obsession had blurred, leaving him to navigate a reality where triumph and torment coexisted inseparably. The final act of the evening, though private, was no less significant than the public spectacle of exposure. Adrian allowed himself a moment to acknowledge the full measure of his orchestration. Every lie revealed, every betrayal punished, every consequence observed, all of it flowed into a singular, haunting clarity. The psychological satisfaction of victory was immense, yet accompanied by an awareness of permanent transformation. Revenge, once executed, leaves no one untouched. The echoes of manipulation and exposure persist indefinitely, shaping the mind, the heart, and the soul. And then, as the night deepened, a subtle anomaly caught Adrian's attention. A message, a shadow of doubt, a suggestion that not all consequences had been accounted for. He paused, considering the implications. Even in victory, even in the precision of exposure and public reckoning, there remained uncertainty. Human behavior is never entirely predictable. Alliances can shift, loyalties can bend, and consequences can ripple in unexpected ways. The thought reminded him that revenge, once set in motion, rarely ends cleanly. It evolves, mutates, and occasionally surprises even the most meticulous strategist. Adrian smiled faintly, a private acknowledgment of the enduring nature of human complexity. He had executed the ultimate act of revenge, dismantling Elena and Marcus, exposing their betrayals, and ensuring that justice, however private, however psychological, had been served, free Taventry Mirror. Yet he also understood that the story, like all stories of vengeance, was not entirely closed. There would be echoes, ripples, and perhaps even surprises in the aftermath. Nothing in the realm of betrayal is ever entirely settled. He returned to the quiet of his apartment, the solitude both comforting and sobering. Objects that had once symbolized trust and connection now served as reminders of the personal transformation that revenge had necessitated. Adrian had become both avenger and witness, executor and observer, strategist and philosopher of human frailty. The psychological scars, though invisible to the outside world, were permanent, and the awareness of what he had endured and what he had unleashed would accompany him indefinitely. Outside, Elena and Marcus faced a reality they had never imagined. Public humiliation, fractured relationships, and shattered influence created a landscape of personal desolation. They could no longer rely on arrogance, charm, or deception. The truth was an unyielding force that demanded acknowledgment. Their private moments were now fraught with tension, their decisions burdened by the weight of exposure, and their interactions forever colored by the certainty of betrayal. And in the quiet spaces between the remnants of their lives, Adrian found his own reflection. He was victorious, undeniable in the execution of his plan, yet transformed irrevocably by the experience. The psychological landscape of betrayal and revenge had left its mark, embedding within him a clarity of purpose, a sharpened perception, and a profound understanding of the consequences of human deception. Victory had been achieved, but it came with an enduring, haunting cost. As the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, casting muted light across the city, Adrian allowed himself one final revenge, once executed with precision, reveals not only the weaknesses of others, but also the hidden depths of one's own psyche. The echoes of betrayal persist, shaping thoughts, altering perceptions, and leaving indelible marks. And though Elena and Marcus had been dismantled, exposed, and humiliated, the story of vengeance, in its quiet, relentless evolution, was never truly over. A final message arrived on his encrypted device, a subtle hint, a shadow of unresolved consequence, a reminder that even the most meticulous plans can produce unforeseen ripples. Adrian smiled, not with fear, but with the recognition that life, betrayal, and revenge are rarely neat, rarely finite, and always capable of surprising even the most careful strategist. The world had shifted, debts had been collected, and justice, cold, precise, and unyielding, had been delivered. Yet the lingering tension, the quiet knowledge that nothing remains entirely settled, reminded him that vigilance, patience, and cunning were eternal companions for anyone who had stared into the depths of human treachery.